They thought it was just paper and ink, a dusty habit for an old woman with nothing better to do. My little leather-bound book, tucked away on the highest shelf, was the punchline of many a family dinner, the silent joke shared in hushed whispers behind cupped hands. They never saw the tiny, meticulous strokes of my pen, charting the constellations of their careless words, the patterns in their dismissive glances, the subtle shifts in their grand performance. To them, I was just a fixture, easily overlooked, like an old oak in the garden, solid, perhaps, but certainly not watching with a purpose. They believed their grand narrative was fixed, carved in stone, unchangeable. But stones, too, can crumble from the inside, if enough patient truth presses against them over years. What happens when the quietest voice suddenly becomes the only one anyone truly hears? The dining room always felt too large when they were all together, swallowing the polite murmurs and turning them into sharp echoes. My own chair, at the head of the polished mahogany, felt less like a seat of honor and more like an observation post. I remember the last Sunday lunch, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, the scent of roast lamb hanging heavy in the air. Robert, my eldest, was holding forth on his latest business venture, his voice booming with the confidence of inherited wealth. Victoria, his wife, sat beside him, her perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on his arm, her eyes scanning the room, always assessing, always judging. Sarah, my daughter, was engrossed in her phone, occasionally offering a simpering laugh at something Robert said, barely looking up from the screen. "Mother, still with your little journal?" Sarah had piped up suddenly, a giggle escaping her lips, drawing Victoria's amused gaze. "Do you write down our witty anecdotes, darling? So you can relive them in your twilight years?" Victoria offered a thin smile. "Oh, Sarah, don't tease. Eleanor's little book is her sanctuary. Full of recipes, I imagine. Or perhaps grievances about slow gardeners." Her tone dripped with honeyed contempt, a familiar taste in my mouth, one I'd grown accustomed to over the years. I simply lifted my teacup, the porcelain warm against my fingers, and took a slow sip. My diary, a simple leather-bound book with pages faintly yellowed, sat on the small side table next to my armchair in the parlor. It was a habit from my youth, a quiet corner where I could collect my thoughts, measure the world. Now, it was just another item they could point to, another piece of my life they deemed quaint, irrelevant, a harmless eccentricity. They saw the worn cover, the aged edges, and immediately assumed its contents were as inconsequential as they believed I was. But that day, something shifted. As Victoria's words hung in the air, I didn't just feel the familiar prick of dismissal. I felt a quiet, almost imperceptible hardening, like clay slowly drying in the sun. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a clarity, a sharp, cold understanding. They saw a diary, I saw a ledger. A place where every slight, every careless word, every act of veiled cruelty wasn't forgotten, but instead, precisely recorded. Later, as the clatter of their departure faded and the house settled back into its usual quiet hum, I walked over to the parlor. My hand brushed the leather cover of the diary. It was more than just my thoughts now. It held their truths, too. As I sat there, tracing the ornate pattern on the cover, I remembered something Robert had said earlier, a passing comment about a small, oddly specific clause in the old family trust, something he'd left off as a mere formality. He spoke of it as if it were a joke, but I'd seen a flicker, a brief moment of almost imperceptible tension in his eyes before he quickly composed himself. That detail, so fleeting, settled into the quiet corners of my mind, ready to be filed away, like everything else. The scent of lavender from the old sachet in my drawer was a familiar comfort as I pulled out the ledger, my diary, as they still thought of it. It had always been a quiet confidant, a place where I could unspool the threads of my day without judgment. Now, as I opened it to a fresh page, it felt different, heavier, imbued with a new purpose. The familiar script of my own hand, usually filled with gentle observations on the changing seasons or the small joys of a quiet afternoon, now seemed to wait, expectant. I thought back to their laughter, sharp and dismissive. Sarah's playful tease, Victoria's thinly veiled contempt. They saw a dotty old woman indulging in a harmless hobby. What they didn't see was the meticulous mind beneath the soft exterior, the memory that catalogued details like a librarian shelving rare books. This ledger wasn't just for my solace anymore, it was to be a mirror, reflecting back the precise images of their own making. My first entry under this new resolution wasn't about feelings or frustrations. It was a simple, factual account of that Sunday lunch. Robert's boisterous pronouncements, Sarah's performative giggles, Victoria's assessing gaze, all laid out, stripped of emotion, reduced to plain observation. I noted the way Robert had dismissed my suggestion about the failing hydrangeas with a wave of his hand, too absorbed in his own grand narrative to truly listen. I recorded Sarah's complaint about the drudgery of visiting, right after accepting a generous allowance from my pension. And Victoria's comment about my grievances about slow gardeners resonated, highlighting her ingrained belief that my concerns were trivial. Then, I turned back a few pages, to where I had first jotted down Robert's offhand remark about the trust clause. It was a cryptic note then, an aside. Now, it felt like a tiny, insistent pebble in my shoe. He'd mentioned a certain dead man's hand provision, laughing it off as archaic legalese. He was so keen to dismiss it, to make it seem insignificant, that it amplified its importance in my mind. Why would he go to such lengths to trivialize something if it truly held no weight? I began a new section, titled simply, Observations. Underneath, I wrote, Robert's dismissiveness concerning the family trust clause. His hurried change of subject. It was the first stone laid in a long, quiet path. The act of writing it down, transforming a fleeting memory into a concrete fact on paper, felt like a silent, powerful assertion. My diary was no longer just a collection of private words, it was a burgeoning repository of objective truth, waiting patiently for its moment to speak. It would not accuse, but merely present. After my resolve hardened, my home, once just a house, became a meticulously laid out map of their habits. The weekly calls from Sarah, once a source of mild irritation, transformed into a predictable rhythm I charted in my ledger. She always called on Tuesdays, usually around 11, often with a breathless story about a trivial dilemma, invariably followed by a request for a little top-up to her account. I recorded the exact phrases she used, the exaggerated sighs, the way she would subtly shift from complaint to appeal. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the expectation, the invisible thread of entitlement she spun. Robert and Victoria, on the other hand, operated with a grander, more infrequent, but no less impactful, pattern. Their visits were announced days in advance, a royal decree almost demanding a specific menu, a particular brand of tea. I began to notice how Victoria would, casually, redirect conversations to topics concerning the upkeep of the family estate, her eyes darting to the deed box I kept hidden, just as she mentioned a new, costly renovation project for her own home. She didn't ask, she subtly pressured, weaving narratives of my declining ability to manage such a large property, hinting at the burden it must be. Each carefully chosen word, each pointed glance, found its way into my ledger, alongside the date and a brief, objective summary. There was a day, a crisp autumn morning, when I overheard Robert on the phone in the study, a room he rarely used. He thought I was out in the garden, pruning the roses. His voice was low, urgent, discussing liquidation and offshore accounts. I couldn't make out much, just fragments, but it sent a small shiver down my spine. It seemed so out of character for the man who prided himself on his local business ethics. He ended the call abruptly, and when he saw me, he offered a charming, if slightly too bright, smile, talking about an old college friend's investment club. It felt like watching a skilled puppeteer, his hands quickly tucked away the moment he knew he was being observed. I noted the date, the time, and the fragments I'd heard, placing it all under the growing entry about the family trust. The more I observed, the more I understood that their lives, so polished on the surface, were held together by unseen threads, carefully arranged and easily manipulated, ready to snag on something sharp. My senses sharpened in the weeks that followed, like a finely tuned instrument. I didn't just listen to their words, I listened to the silences between them, the things left unsaid. Small omissions, minor exaggerations, inconsistencies that, on their own, meant little, but together, began to sketch a disturbing portrait. Sarah's requests for money grew more frequent, the top-ups becoming less about trivial dilemmas and more about keeping up appearances. She spoke of exclusive gym memberships and designer clothes, always lamenting her bad luck and the unfairness of life, as if she were a victim of circumstance rather than her own choices. One afternoon, she called to complain about a bill for a boutique dress, claiming it was an unexpected expense. Yet, just a few days prior, she'd posted a picture on social media, beaming, wearing that exact dress at a lavish charity event. I simply noted the date, the cost, and the discrepancy in my ledger. It was a small thread, but threads weave ropes. Robert and Victoria continued their subtle campaign regarding the estate. Victoria brought me brochures for retirement communities, highlighting their excellent medical facilities and peace of mind. She even accidentally left one open on my coffee table, emphasizing how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large house alone. Robert, for his part, began to talk openly about selling off some of the family's less profitable assets, a parcel of undeveloped land on the outskirts of town, for example, that had been in the family for generations. He framed it as practical, good business sense. But I knew that land held significant sentimental value, a place where my late husband and I had often walked. The way he spoke about it, so detached, so clinical, struck me. One day, while searching for an old recipe in my late husband's study, I stumbled upon a thick, leather-bound volume tucked away behind some dusty law books. It wasn't the family trust itself, but a collection of historical property deeds and agreements, some dating back generations. As I flipped through, a particular document caught my eye. An old, handwritten amendment to the original trust, carefully sealed and dated, concerning a specific condition tied to the undeveloped land Robert had mentioned. It stated that should the land be sold outside the family without the matriarch's explicit, notarized consent, the entire trust would be immediately dissolved and its assets redistributed equally among all living descendants. Robert had mentioned the land, but never this. It was a quiet detail, easily overlooked, but its implications were vast. The ledger now gained a new, urgent focus. My garden, a place of quiet contemplation, had always been my retreat. Now, it was where I cultivated not just roses, but understanding. Their disdain, once a nettle under my skin, began to feel like a heavy cloak, offering an unexpected shelter. They saw a woman content with her plants and her quiet habits, too simple to grasp the machinations of their modern world. They spoke freely around me, confident that my mind was preoccupied with the mundane, that I heard only what they allowed me to. This assumption was my greatest ally. I perfected the art of the placid nod, the gentle smile, the slight tilt of the head that signaled polite, unengaged listening. While Sarah regaled me with tales of her struggles, a chipped nail, a friend's slight, always returning to the theme of her financial plight, I let my gaze drift, seemingly lost in the patterns of light on the carpet. But inside, I was connecting dots, cross-referencing her complaints with the social media posts I occasionally glimpsed, noting the dates and locations of her purported struggles versus her actual lavish outings. It was like watching a magician's trick, knowing exactly where the diversion was meant to draw the eye, while the real action happened elsewhere. Robert and Victoria were less frequent visitors, but their intentions were grander, their plays more intricate. Victoria, with her practiced sympathy, once sighed deeply about the onerous paperwork involved in managing my affairs, suggesting an external trust management firm. She even brought a pre-filled form for my signature, a seemingly innocuous document that detailed a full relinquishment of my oversight. "Just to save you the bother, dear," she'd cooed. My hand paused, just for a moment, above the dotted line. I politely declined, citing my own, perhaps old-fashioned preference for handling my own affairs. She didn't press, merely offered a tight, disappointed smile, confident that she had at least planted the seed. It was then I realized the depth of their blindness. They saw me as a figurehead, a relic, certainly not someone who might understand a dead man's hand, clause or decipher the subtle language of offshore accounts. Their contempt was not just for my perceived lack of worldliness, but for my very being. This allowed me to move through their lives, an invisible observer in plain sight, collecting the pieces of their truth without them ever suspecting. The amendment to the trust I'd found became a silent compass, guiding my observations. I even began to discreetly inquire about local notary services, just to understand the process for myself, should the need arise. It was a small step, a preparation for an eventuality they could never foresee. The spring afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn as Robert and Victoria arrived for an unannounced visit. They carried a casserole, a rare gesture of domesticity from Victoria, which immediately put me on alert. Their visits rarely came without an agenda. After a brief, strained chat about the weather, Robert steered the conversation, as I knew he would, towards the family's portfolio. He spoke of market trends, the necessity of streamlining assets, his gaze eventually drifting towards the window, in the direction of the undeveloped land on the far side of the property. "Mother, about that old parcel," he began, carefully, "I've had a renewed offer. Quite generous, actually. It really is sitting idle, and we could put that capital to much better use." I paused, arranging a small vase of daffodils. "Oh, that land," I murmured, as if considering it for the first time in ages. "It always held such a special place in your father's heart, you know. We used to walk there every Sunday, before you children were born. He even had a notion of planting a small arboretum there, for the community, eventually." Victoria, who had been listening with an air of practiced patience, let out a delicate cough. "An arboretum, Eleanor? At your age? And with all the upkeep of this house, darling, surely you don't need another project." Her eyes flickered towards Robert, a silent conversation passing between them. "Perhaps not for me to plant now, no," I said, with a wistful smile, "but it's a lovely thought. And I was just speaking with Mrs. Albright from the Historical Society the other day. She was quite keen on any older family properties being preserved, for their natural beauty, you understand. She even mentioned a few local grants that might be available for such purposes." "Just a thought." Robert's easy smile faltered, a hairline crack appearing in his composure. He cleared his throat. "Grants, Mother? For undeveloped land? That's an interesting idea." He glanced at Victoria, a more urgent look this time. My seemingly innocent remarks about an arboretum and Mrs. Albright had subtly complicated his plans, making the quick, quiet sale of the land less straightforward. They now had to contend with my sentimental attachment and the potential involvement of the Historical Society, all without knowing my true leverage. It was the slightest push, barely a ripple, yet I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, recalculating. The true value of their underestimation was that they would never suspect a simple, wistful memory could hold such a quiet, strategic weight. A few weeks passed in a quiet that felt almost too profound, like the hush before a storm. My ledger filled steadily with more observations. Sarah's increasing complaints about her tight budget, while simultaneously planning a luxurious weekend retreat. Victoria's new, expensive handbag casually flaunted during a video call, clearly an attempt to subtly emphasize her and Robert's success, contrasting with my simpler life. But it was the silence from Robert about the undeveloped land that spoke the loudest. My casual mention of the Arboretum and Mrs. Albright from the Historical Society had evidently thrown a wrench into his streamlined plans. Then, one Tuesday, not Sarah's usual calling hour, my phone rang. It was Robert. His voice, usually so steady and commanding, had an edge to it, like a knife scraping against stone. "Mother, about that land," he began, without preamble. "It seems your charming little chat with the Historical Society has put a rather large spanner in the works. They've sent a formal inquiry, requesting details on potential preservation initiatives." I feigned a gentle sigh. "Oh, dear. Mrs. Albright, bless her heart, is so passionate about these things. I merely mentioned your father's old dream, a passing thought. I suppose word travels quickly in a small town, doesn't it?" There was a frustrated exhale on his end of the line. "Word travels, Mother, and deals become complicated. The buyer is now hesitant, citing potential environmental regulations and public interest. It's delaying everything." His polished façade was beginning to show faint, almost imperceptible stress lines around the edges. He spoke of his fiduciary duty and maximizing family assets, but underneath it, I heard the subtle tremor of a man whose carefully constructed scheme was facing an unexpected snag. He even hinted at bringing in lawyers to sort out this nuisance. Lawyers? "For an arboretum idea?" I asked, my voice pitched with mild, feigned surprise. "Surely, Robert, that's a bit extreme for such a simple, heartfelt idea. Your father would be so pleased to know the land might be cherished in that way." He mumbled something about misunderstandings, and ended the call somewhat abruptly. Later that week, Victoria called, not with another pre-filled form, but with a thinly veiled complaint about Robert's sudden stress and unforeseen complications with a certain land deal. The veneer of effortless control they had always projected was cracking. My quiet words about a forgotten dream and a well-meaning old woman had, indeed, introduced a small, yet significant, obstacle in their path, revealing the first faint fissures in their carefully constructed reality. They believed I was weaving a dream. I knew I was setting a tripwire. They called a meeting, a private consultation, at their office, the one with the gleaming glass and steel that always felt too cold for genuine conversation. Robert, ever the busy executive, spoke of needing to expedite the land deal of a new buyer with a keen interest, implying that any further delay would be a personal affront to progress itself. Victoria sat beside him, nodding earnestly, occasionally interjecting with observations about the rising cost of property taxes, painting a picture of my continued ownership as a burden I was inflicting upon myself. I sat across from them, sipping my Earl Grey, my placid expression a mask they had long grown accustomed to. They slid a stack of papers across the polished table, sales agreements, notarization forms, all ready for my signature. Robert tapped a pen impatiently against a pristine page. Just a formality, Mother. A few signatures, and we can finally free up that capital for something truly worthwhile. I reached for the documents, my fingers tracing the crisp, cold paper. Oh, these old things. It reminds me, I mused aloud, my voice gentle, almost a whisper, of your dear father. He was so meticulous with his paperwork, you know. Especially with the family trust. I remember him poring over every word, making sure everything was just so. He even added a little handwritten note, a special amendment, about the undeveloped land. Something about a dead man's hand provision, wasn't it? Robert's hand, mid-tap, froze. Victoria's earnest smile stretched, then began to wobble at the edges. A silence descended, heavier than any I had ever witnessed in their presence. They looked at each other, a frantic, unspoken exchange passing between them, before Robert forced a laugh that sounded brittle, like breaking glass. The dead man's hand. Mother, really, that's just an old wives' tale, legal jargon from a bygone era. It has no bearing on a simple land sale, doesn't it? I asked, my gaze soft, but unwavering. I seem to recall it specifically stated that should the land be sold outside the family without the matriarch's explicit, notarized consent, the entire trust would be immediately dissolved. All assets, redistributed equally. Your father was quite firm on that. He said it was to ensure fairness, to protect all his descendants, not just one or two. The color drained from Robert's face, leaving it a sickly gray. Victoria's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as if seeing me, truly seeing me, for the very first time. The carefully constructed façade they presented to the world, and to me, had not merely cracked, it had shattered, revealing the frantic desperation beneath. The pages of my ledger, invisible to them, had just spoken their first undeniable truth. The silence in their gleaming office was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic flicker in Robert's eyes. Victoria, ever the image of composure, looked as though her perfectly sculpted face was about to crack. Mother, Robert finally sputtered, his voice devoid of its usual authority, this is absurd. A handwritten note? Lawyers will laugh that out of court. Perhaps, I replied, a slight shrug. But then, why did your father insist on having it notarized by Mr. Henderson himself, all those years ago? The very same Mr. Henderson who still practices family law down on Elm Street. He has a notoriously good memory for the precise details of old family documents, especially ones concerning large estates. Another unspoken conversation passed between them, a desperate dance of fear and accusation. This was the moment their carefully constructed world, built on assumptions and concealed truths, began to show its true fragility. Robert pulled out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen with an urgency I hadn't seen before. He was calling someone, no doubt his own lawyers, hoping to find a loophole, a way to stitch their narrative back together. This is all a misunderstanding, Eleanor, Victoria interjected, her voice now sharp, stripped of its saccharine politeness. Robert has worked tirelessly for this family. You can't possibly want to destroy everything? Destroy? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I merely pointed out the terms of your father's wishes. Terms that ensure fairness for all his descendants. Isn't that what family is about? Their panic intensified. The phone call Robert was on became heated, fragments of unexpected complications and significant exposure reaching my ears. He was no longer trying to control me, he was trying to staunch a gushing wound. My presence, once a benign oversight, was now a direct threat to their entire edifice. The next few days were a flurry of frantic phone calls. Sarah, usually so detached, called me in a near panic. "Mother, Robert says you're trying to ruin us. What's this about the trust? He said if it dissolves, my allowance, everything changes." Her voice was shrill, the mask of a carefree life falling away to reveal a terrified dependency. She had always relied on Robert's management of the family funds, never truly understanding the source or the structure. Now, the comfort of her unquestioned access was jeopardized, and she was terrified. I offered a calm, measured explanation, reiterating the clause, the equal redistribution. The realization dawned on her, not of the justice of it, but of the direct, personal threat to her lifestyle. It wasn't just Robert and Victoria's empire that was shaking, it was Sarah's entire foundation of effortless living. The liquidation and offshore accounts Robert had been so discreet about now became clear. He had been attempting to secure his own substantial portion before the trust could be dissolved. He had been planning to sell the land, trigger the dissolution, and then have his share disappear into accounts only he controlled, leaving Sarah and me with scraps. But my quiet revelation had put a stop to that. The gears had stopped turning in their favor, and now, they were simply grinding. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken tension after that meeting. Robert and Victoria ceased their direct visits, replaced by a flurry of increasingly urgent, though still polite, letters from their lawyers, pressing for my cooperation regarding the land sale. They spoke of looming deadlines, of a very interested party, whose patience was wearing thin. They offered revised figures, escalating incentives, each document a thinly veiled attempt to entice me away from the sentimental attachment they still believed was my only objection. They even suggested a series of consultations with independent financial advisors to help me understand the benefits of their proposal. I filed each one meticulously, my ledger growing heavier with every passing day. I knew their desperation was a sign. Robert's attempts at liquidating assets, his offshore inquiries, these were not the actions of a man confident in his legal standing. He was trying to secure his portion before the inevitable. Victoria, too, grew noticeably agitated, her social media posts, usually a carefully curated display of opulence, now carried an undercurrent of brittle cheer, too bright to be genuine. One crisp autumn morning, a package arrived from Robert's lawyer. It contained a final, unequivocal offer for the undeveloped land, along with a new set of signing documents and a date for a public auction, framed as a necessary step to maximize value. The auction was set for the following week. This was it. They had decided to force my hand, hoping I would buckle under the pressure of finality, or simply be too old and confused to react. They believed I would be unprepared. They were wrong. That very afternoon, I made an appointment with Mr. Henderson. His office was old-fashioned, smelling of leather and old paper, a welcome contrast to the cold glass of Robert's firm. I placed the leather-bound volume containing the original trust and the handwritten amendment on his desk. He adjusted his spectacles, a kind, knowing twinkle in his eye, and began to read. His memory, as I had surmised, was indeed remarkable. He confirmed the amendment's validity, its precise wording, and the notarization process he himself had overseen decades ago. The dead man's hand clause, he affirmed, was ironclad. With Mr. Henderson's confirmation in hand, I did not sign their papers. Instead, I sent my own letter, a concise, formal declaration, hand-delivered to Robert's office, with copies sent to Mr. Henderson and to Sarah. It simply stated that per the specific terms of the family trust's duly notarized amendment, any sale of the undeveloped land without my explicit, notarized consent would immediately trigger the trust's dissolution and the equal redistribution of all its assets. I attached a copy of the amendment. The tide, once a gentle lapping at their feet, was now beginning its unhurried, inevitable rush. The impact was swift and brutal. The public auction, once a strategic move for Robert, became his undoing. The moment word of the amendment spread, The very interested party vanished. The local press, alerted by an anonymous tip, which I'm sure Mrs. Albright would have thoroughly appreciated, picked up on the story of the family matriarch, the forgotten amendment, and the potential scandal. Robert's carefully constructed image of a shrewd, ethical businessman began to crumble under the glare of public scrutiny. The trust, as per its terms, was immediately frozen, pending formal dissolution. Sarah's weekly allowance, along with Robert and Victoria's access to the family funds, evaporated overnight. Their deceptions, once hidden beneath layers of dismissive smiles and corporate jargon, were not just exposed, they were washed away by the relentless current of truth, leaving them stranded on barren ground. The unfolding of events after my letter was like watching a slow, inevitable tide recede, revealing what had always been beneath the surface. The phone, which had once rung with their demands and thinly veiled insults, now chimed with the breathless inquiries of local reporters, their questions sharp and eager. I politely declined them all, finding a quiet satisfaction in the silence that followed. My role had been to reveal the truth, not to parade it. The news articles, clipped by Mrs. Albright and sent to me with a triumphant, underlined passage, detailed Robert's spiraling situation. His business dealings were under scrutiny, his reputation, once so meticulously crafted, now stained by the scandal of the frozen trust and the allegations of his preemptive asset transfers. Victoria, his constant shadow, had vanished from the society pages she once dominated. Her carefully curated social media, once a vibrant stream of designer labels and lavish events, had gone eerily silent. Their world, built on a foundation of inherited privilege and a carefully managed image, was indeed crumbling, not from my direct hand, but from the simple weight of the truth I had placed into the light. Sarah, however, was less subtle. Her calls became desperate, shrill pleas for me to fix it, to make it go away. She didn't understand the concept of cause and effect, only that her comfortable life had been abruptly interrupted. She spoke of having to downsize, of actually looking for a job, as if these were fates worse than death. Her entitlement, once an invisible thread, was now a tangled, visible mess of panic. I listened, sometimes offering gentle, unhelpful platitudes about learning resilience, knowing that she would never truly grasp the liberation that came with earning one's own way. It was not my place to salvage her comfort, only to ensure a just distribution of what was truly hers. My days resumed their familiar rhythm, yet everything felt lighter, clearer. The garden, my sanctuary, seemed to bloom with a new vibrancy. I found myself humming old tunes as I tended to the roses, a lightness in my step that hadn't been there in years. There was no elation, no vengeful joy, just a profound sense of quiet satisfaction, like the stillness that settles after a long-awaited rain. Justice, I realized, didn't roar. It simply arrived, an unhurried tide, washing clean the shores of deception. The bitterness that had quietly resided within me, a tiny, hard stone, had finally dissolved, leaving behind a clear, open space. I began to reread my ledger, not as a record of grievances, but as a testament to the methodical unfolding of truth, a quiet chronicle of my own liberation. The dissolution of the trust was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet dismantling, piece by careful piece. Mr. Henderson oversaw it all with his meticulous hand, ensuring that every asset, every long-held share, was indeed redistributed equally, as my husband's amendment had dictated. It was a process that took time, like the slow turning of the seasons, but I felt no impatience. My ledger, once a chronicle of their deceit, now bore the final, satisfying entries, dates of legal filings, notifications, and, finally, the confirmations of new accounts. Robert's professional life, once his shining armor, became his public undoing. The allegations of preemptive asset transfers, coupled with the scandal of the frozen trust, painted him not as the shrewd businessman he presented himself to be, but as a manipulative schemer. His firm, once prestigious, saw clients drift away. Victoria, true to form, disappeared from public view almost entirely, her once vibrant social media feed now a ghost town of outdated posts, a silent testament to a life she could no longer afford to project. They faded, not with a bang, but with a whimper, into the obscurity they had always disdained. Sarah, however, clung to the fraying edges of my attention. Her calls still came, though less frequently, and the frantic pleas had given way to a dull resentment, She had indeed found a job, a modest one, and the tales of her struggles were no longer about chipped nails, but about rent and bills. I listened, sometimes. I offered no more than what was legally and equitably hers from the dissolved trust, a sum far smaller than the endless allowances she had come to expect. She learned, as all unburdened children must, that the world does not owe you comfort simply for existing. It was not a lesson I wished upon her with malice, but one she desperately needed. There was no joy in her discomfort, but there was a quiet understanding that the scales, at last, balanced. The undeveloped land, the spark that ignited this whole affair, became the arboretum my husband had dreamed of. With the equal redistribution, a portion of the funds was set aside by my own hand, and with the enthusiastic backing of Mrs. Albright and the Historical Society, the land was protected, slowly transforming into a tranquil space for the community. Sometimes I would walk there, watching the saplings sway in the breeze, imagining my husband smiling. It was a place not of profit, but of peace, a living monument to quiet dreams. My life, unmoored from their expectations and endless demands, unfolded with a spaciousness I hadn't known since my youth. The house, once a silent battleground, was now simply a home, filled with books and music and the scent of freshly baked bread, free from their critical gazes. My ledger, now truly a diary once more, contained reflections not on their misdeeds, but on the quiet strength I had discovered within myself. I wrote about the joy of an unhurried morning, the satisfaction of a garden well tended, the surprising friendships I forged with people who saw me for who I was, not for what I represented to them. I was no longer the matriarch presiding over a fractured, entitled family, but simply Eleanor. The woman who had, through quiet observation and unyielding resolve, chosen justice over complicity, liberation over a gilded cage. My horizon stretched out, vast and clear, unburdened by their past judgments, their endless needs, or the echoes of their laughter. The silence that had once defined my suffering now defined my freedom, a silence filled with the gentle hum of a life finally, truly, my own. Eleanor's journey, wasn't it, a profound echo of how the quietest among us can possess the most formidable strength? It reminds me that true power isn't always found in a booming voice or a grand gesture, but often in the meticulous patience of a steady hand, turning pages, recording truths. Her liberation wasn't a sudden burst of vengeance, but the slow, inevitable unfolding of justice, much like a tide revealing what lay hidden beneath the surface. To find such peace, unburdened by the echoes of past judgments, is a testament to the profound strength of self-preservation. What a powerful reminder that sometimes the most resonant vindication is the one whispered by the truth itself. If Eleanor's quiet triumph resonated deep within your spirit, and you yearn for more stories where the underestimated rise and truth finds its own path, then please consider supporting Vengeful Echoes. A like, a share, or a subscription helps us bring more tales of strategic justice to light. May your own days be filled with the tranquility of a clear conscience, your home with genuine warmth, and your heart with the quiet strength to navigate any challenge life may bring.